everyone, this is the start of Unit 7. In Unit 7, we're approaching things a little bit differently in your course, as you may have noticed. We're going to have two quizzes and a discussion for the total of your work in Unit 7 instead of having a big test along with checkpoints, quizzes, and other written assignments. We're doing this in an effort to kind of condense the material and give you guys a chance to really review this and understand the key concepts that are going to be asked on your final exam. It will also give you a chance to go back and review next week as we prepare to take final exams and get caught up on any work while still covering what we need to in Unit 7. So on your first quiz, 7.03, you're going to see your first three lessons covered. And these first three lessons are 701, 702, and 703. They are all about the settlement of the West and how the West developed in the early, mid, and later 1800s, and then finally how the West actually closed the frontier, how there became no more frontier, and how the Wild West was no more. We're also going to talk about how myth and reality were very different from one another when it comes to our perception of the West from video games, from movies, and from books, and how it actually was. So let's get started with settling the American West. In 7.01, our first lesson called The Great American Desert, we learn about why people came to the West and what they were seeking. Pretty much after the Civil War, a lot of people were looking for a fresh start. They had either lost their jobs, lost their families, or lost their fortunes, and they needed to look somewhere else for new opportunity. And that place happened to be the West for many people. Now, that didn't only happen for people from within the United States. A lot of immigrants from different areas came looking for opportunity too. And this goes for those coming from China and those even coming from places like Ireland and working on the Transcontinental Railroad as it was being built. So the goals for this lesson are to explain the role of the railroads in the settlement of the West, describe the role of the U.S. government in building of the Transcontinental and Railroad, and describe the era of open range cattle ranching and the reasons for its end. Okay, so the focus is going to be on settlement, the railroad, and ranching in the West. Our reading for this lesson is between page 460 and 469. You do have a reading guide for this lesson, which is right here. So as we go through the textbook today and the lesson slides together, make sure that you pause the recording first and print off your reading guide. There are going to be a lot of things that I mentioned that will be answered within your reading guide. Now, you're still going to need to go through and read these textbook pages on your own, but this guide will help you a little bit to get started. In your lesson here, it talks about railroads, mines, and ranches. Now, these were new industries that popped up in the West. As the country was getting bigger, they needed more and more natural resources or resources to keep going. For example, in the Northwest of the country, up where we now know Washington and Oregon, those areas were heavily used for lumber, for lumbering. And the timber production there produced a lot of wood that was being used to construct new homes, the railroad, you name it, all sorts of new things. So all sorts of new industries emerged. You're going to see in your lesson this activity here pop up. And the West, there is a true false activity here asking whether or not each statement is true or false. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about the West. One of them is that virtually all cowboys of the American West were all white. This is actually false. A lot of the cowboys in the West were ex-slaves who were looking for work, immigrants that were coming north from Mexico into the United States looking for opportunity, who were actually very good with cattle and had the experience to work with driving cattle to market. That's how they actually got cattle to market. Okay. Texas cattle ranchers used railroads to move their herds from southern Texas ranches to cattle towns such as Abilene and Dodge City, that one's actually false. Most of the time, cattle ranchers used trains. I'm sorry, not trains. They actually drove the cattle instead of putting them on railroad carts to keep them alive and moving and keep them healthy until they got to their location. Okay, actually, oil was discovered in Texas. That is true. Most of the settlement of the Great Plains resulted from the sale of privately owned land to settlers in 1862. That would be true. Virginia City grew into thriving towns. I'm sorry, that's actually false because it was actually not privately owned land, it was government owned land. So you can get a sense here of how you would be doing this exercise of choosing true or false as you go, and then you can actually check your answers as you go. So we've done about half of the activity here talking about the myths so far that are connected with the West, so you can test your prior knowledge. Now we're going to be talking a lot about expansion in the West, and as I mentioned before, a lot of people were going west because they were looking to start over for a new life. They were looking for new fortune. Maybe to start over completely. And a lot of people got out west by using the Transcontinental Railroad, or the railroad at the time. No matter how far it went, it got a lot of people at least out to the Midwest. The Transcontinental Railroad was actually something established by Lincoln. He, during his administration, during the Civil War, put through the Pacific Railway Act. The federal government had a very big role, a very substantial role in promoting and financing the railroad. They knew that the railroad would advertise heavily and try to get people to go out west, and because that, they tried to support the railroad in what it was doing and gave it an awful lot of money to continue its operations. The Pacific Railway Act was part of that. They got a lot of government money to lay track, and it became a competition between two major companies for the railroad. Okay, you had the Union Pacific and you had the Central Pacific companies trying to go together to form the Transcontinental Railroad. One started on the western coast, and the other one started in the middle of the country and tried to work its way west. They tried to meet in the middle. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad did actually meet in Utah, where the celebration happened as the Transcontinental Railway was finished. So it was completed in Utah, and the Transcontinental was complete. So the Central Pacific meets the Union Pacific. There's actually a picture of it right here in your textbook on page 464. The two major companies that were basically hired a lot by the government to build this railroad met in Utah at Promontory Point on May 10th, 1869. Okay, so they actually met in the middle. Now, there was a really big mix of people going into the West for these different reasons. A lot of people who worked on the railroad were Irish. Some of them, a lot of them were Chinese immigrants that were looking for a new life in the United States. And even though there was a lot of doubt to how well the Chinese immigrants would work on the railroad, they ended up doing very well and showed very skilled labor and bravery working on the railroad. So there was quite a diverse mix. In this section called a diverse mix, it gets more into what areas certain groups actually settled into. Okay, it says immigrants arrived from Russia and Eastern Europe, Germany, and especially Scandinavia. And they would set up in the Midwest, especially in the grasslands of Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakota territories, and settle there to try to farm on the frontier. The gold rush would actually bring out other fortune seekers trying to go to the west after the gold rush, and some of them would stay out there and try to make their life there. And that was really the start of a lot of this interest in going west. Okay, examples of these boom towns would be Deadwood. Okay, and other places that would uh, sprout up because something was discovered there, like gold or some kind of resource, or silver would sprout up there, and people would go to try to make their fortunes. Now, there were new kinds of industries that established themselves in the West. A lot of it was mining, as we saw, gold was discovered, and that prompted the gold rush. Also, silver. Okay, discovered in 1859, the Comstock lode shown here is a cutaway view that includes tunnels and mines yielded hundreds of millions of dollars of silver and gold ore. So you can see in this picture here a cutaway of what the mine looked like, the mine structure, and how the West really did provide a lot of riches and fortune if you were able to find it, and risk enough capital and money to get it. But it once it was out and it was done, there wasn't a lot of money to be had, so there was a bit of a risk. Cattle ranchers and cowboys were common in the West, but not in the way that we think. A lot of the times we think that cowboys were, white cowboys who were sheriffs and marshals and had a lot of gunfights. Most of them really didn't know how to shoot so well. They didn't use their guns an awful lot. They used more ropes for wrangling the cattle, and had very, very difficult lives out on the prairie working with the cattle. So it wasn't the kind of image that we normally saw. They were frequently ex-slaves, or immigrants from Mexico coming up to work there. So it really wasn't the stereotypical version that we knew. Now, cattle as a bigger business did develop eventually. The problem with free range ranching and bringing cattle, driving cattle from one location to another to market, was that overgrazing occurred. So overgrazing actually ended open range cattle ranching by the 1890s, really. That's when it started to end. Barbed wire also carved out the territory and really limited where ranching could take place. There wasn't a lot that they could do. You couldn't move, you really couldn't move an open herd of cattle through a territory if you didn't know if it was fenced off or not. You all know what barbed wire looks like, and could be very dangerous. If it wraps around an animal, it can easily kill them, or at the minimum, seriously hurt them. Now, timber did develop in the Pacific Northwest as well. You can see a big picture here of a felled redwood in California from 1890 on the bottom of your page in 469. So in the Northwest, the natural resources that were provided there was largely timber, and it really provided a lot of the resources needed for the growing country. Okay. Oil was also discovered in Texas, and that was another one of the booming industries at the time. Once you get to page 469 in your textbook, you'll see that you get to the end of your reading for 701. And have a couple of slides here about the cowboys, and the difference between what they were like in our movies, books, and video games, and what they were really like on the frontier. So you should go through this and learn about the cowboys that were typically of some other nationality. They were usually African American, they were usually Mexican Americans, Native Americans. Those were the true cowboys of the West. So there are a couple images here of cowboys of different nationalities plying their trade and showing us how it's done. You can go through the rest of the slides and learn a little bit about how much money they made, only about $25 a month for harsh conditions out on the trail. I'm going to be doing an instructional video for 702 and 703 directly following this, so please make sure to watch all three before you take your quiz 703. Please contact me with any questions.